The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. At that time, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and behold, a Canaanite woman of that district came and called out, "Have pity on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But Jesus did not say a word in answer to her. Jesus' disciples came and asked him, "Send her away, for she keeps calling out after us." He said in reply, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But the woman came and did Jesus homage, saying, "Lord, help me." He said in reply, "It is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Please, Lord, for even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the table of their masters." Then Jesus said to her in reply, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And the woman's daughter was healed from that hour. The Gospel of the Lord. If you are troubled by that story, if Jesus seems a bit rude in that story, you're not the only one that thinks so. Because it certainly appears that when Jesus says to her, "It is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs," it certainly seems like an insulting comment. But of course, you and I know that Jesus would not do that. He would not insult this woman. So it leaves us to figure out, well, what's going on? And biblical scholars and people who study this sort of thing, they've been trying for years to come up with different explanations, if you will. All are perfectly valid ideas. We just don't have enough information to know exactly. One is that perhaps while that line sounds to us right now as rather insulting, 2,000 years ago, it would not have been heard in that same way. In a similar way, there's an issue about the translation of the word that is translated here, dog, that maybe it wasn't, the word Jesus is using isn't the street dog kind of thing, which would be a derogatory reference, but rather something more akin to a pet. There's also the thought that, well, what Jesus is doing here is drawing out the woman's faith, trying to verify, make certain, make sure that she has the faith that she seems to have. All those are, as I said, valid possibilities. I'd like to offer you a different one, something that I came across a few years ago from a biblical teacher by the name of Steve Dockery. And it came to mind this week just in light of the news of the last couple of months and a story which I'll share with you that I read earlier this week. In order to get this angle, you have to start by hearing a statement that's going to be shocking to you perhaps, but I can assure you it's perfectly true. And that is that the disciples were prejudiced. I don't say that in a negative way. I don't say that in a judgmental way, but rather just in a factual way. These guys are Jews. They know that God started with Abraham and then certainly with Moses. As Moses brought the people out of Egypt, God said, "This is my people." They knew that they were part of the chosen people. And sheer logic then tells you that if they're part of the chosen people, this woman and everybody else that's living in Tyre and Sidon, they're not God's chosen people. What you do with that, of course, can vary. God's prophets kept reminding Israel that this wasn't status for them, this was responsibility. They were supposed to be a light to the other nations, and Israel did not always live up to that promise, to that responsibility. But there's no doubt that the disciples would have mental thoughts going on through their head that basically would reveal their prejudice. So, for example, they probably aren't too comfortable even being in this area where Jesus has taken them. Some of you may remember that line about that expression, shake the dust off your sandals. I'm sure the disciples were anxious for that very moment when they got back into Israel and they could literally take their sandals off and shake the dust of this Gentile nation off them because they weren't chosen and the Jews were. You appreciate that Jesus, of course, is not thinking the same way as the disciples, because he knows that the church, the kingdom, is open to everyone. And I just think that there's a great deal as you go through the gospel stories where Jesus is sort of, if you will, laying the groundwork for the disciples so that they are able in the near future to allow Gentiles into the church. Some of you know that story, that series of stories in the book of Acts, where the early church really struggled with this idea, should Gentiles be allowed in the church? And so with all that as a little bit of background, walk through this. Maybe you'll see where this is heading. So if you appreciate the disciples are not comfortable where they are, then you'll appreciate that they're even less comfortable about this woman calling out after them. They don't want to be bothered with her. They just as soon not interact with anybody there. And I wonder when Jesus also doesn't say something, if he's sort of, if you will, in the heads of the disciples. And he knows they don't want to deal with this woman, and so he's sort of, okay, we won't. But then when she gets to be, I guess, a bit of a pest, and the disciples finally say to Jesus, would you just deal with this? Would you get rid of this woman so that we can get out of here? And then notice the first line that Jesus says to the disciples. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I think that's Jesus saying to the disciples what's in their head. I suspect that's what's going through their minds at that point. Why are we here? Why are we in Gentile territory? You were sent to Israel. You weren't sent to Tyre and Sidon. Why are we here? I just wonder if Jesus is mirroring their thoughts. And then the woman does him homage, asks for the healing for her daughter. And then Jesus says this. It's not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs. I wonder if that line is as insulting as it seems, but that Jesus did not say it to the woman, but rather turned to the disciples and said it to them. Saying to the disciples, in essence, this is what you're thinking, right? This is what you're thinking. I should not heal this woman because I'm giving what is good to dogs. And I just wonder if that moment the disciples had just a little bit of an inkling of their own thought process. And then Jesus looks at the woman and tells her she's got wonderful faith and heals her daughter from afar. This idea of being confronted by our own prejudice, I think that's a really good thing. Because I don't know about you, but I've never met anybody that was willing to start a conversation or in the midst of a conversation say, oh yes, I'm prejudiced. I mean, it's not something we say because mostly out of ignorance, we don't realize that it's in us. We certainly don't want to be prejudiced, but much like the disciples, so much of it is subtle. How we grew up, what we were taught. So how does Jesus confront us today? Oh, lots of ways, I suppose, but for me at least, it's through stories. I enjoy reading stories about people that I'll never get a chance to meet. And I read a good one this week. Older teenager, black teenager. He's into bicycling, and he's evidently pretty good. He's got some talent, and he's even considering if it's possible for him to be a professional bicyclist. His neighbor, it turns out, owned a high-end bicycle, expensive bicycle, very well made, and he loaned it to this boy who was thrilled. One of the things about high-end bikes, it allows you to go fast, much faster than you can on cheaper bikes. And so if you can picture this teenager, he gets on this bike and he is just thrilled. Like it just opens up this whole new world for him, and he just keeps shifting gears and going faster and faster and faster, and he's just like in this moment of euphoria. And he gets pulled over by the police. And in the conversation that unfolds, they basically say to him, "We think you stole this bike because you're riding so fast. It looks to us like you stole it and now you're riding fast to get away." And the first thing that I thought of after I read that was I realized that there was no chance, zero chance, that any policeman was going to pull me to the side of the road, look at me and my high-end bicycle, and accuse me of stealing it. And then the second thing that came to my mind was I wondered if I had the same thought process in my head that those policemen did. In other words, if I saw a teenager, a black teenager, riding down one of the trails with, by me or, coming towards me, something like that, and I saw him on a high-end bicycle, would it even cross my mind that the young man had stolen the bicycle? And then the third thing that sort of was there, it just sort of felt like the good Lord was sort of whispering to me, like I suspect he was saying to the disciples. Are you thinking this? I mean, is this in your head? You need to do better.